Hello, everyone. Welcome back. You may have noticed that I've changed the thumbnail and the title of this weekly posting that I'm doing to Words of Wisdom. And on the thumbnail, it's Words of Wisdom from Men and Women of Faith. And I thought that that was much more appropriate because, again, what I'm doing through these weekly postings is just sharing words of wisdom and encouragement and affirmation from some of my favorite authors. And that just felt more appropriate. So that's what the change is. But you've come to the right place. I wanted to, today we are going to continue in Max Lucado's Great House of God. And I hope you've been encouraged by this. I have read this book, I don't know how many times. And my heart has been touched again as we've been reading through this the last few weeks. And I'm looking forward to the next few weeks of finishing it up. So we are going to be starting with chapter 5, and we're entering into the chapel, which I love. And the subtitle of this one is When Man Covers His Mouth. These are the words of our friend Max. When I lived in Brazil, I took my mom and her friend to see, and I'm sure I'm pronouncing this incorrectly, Iguaçu Falls, the largest waterfalls in the world. Some weeks earlier, I'd become an expert on the cataracts by reading an article in National Geographic magazine. Surely, I thought, my guests would appreciate their good fortune in having me as their guide. To reach the lookout point, tourists must walk a winding trail through a forest. I took advantage of the hike to give a nature report to my mom and her friend. So full of information I chattered the entire time. After some minutes, however, I caught myself speaking louder and louder. A sound in the distance forced me to raise my voice. With each turn in the trail, my volume increased. Finally, I was shouting above a roar which was proving to be quite irritating. Whatever that noise is, I wish they'd shut it off so I could complete my lecture. Only after reaching the clearing did I realize that the noise we heard was the waterfalls. My words were drowned out by the force and fury of what I was trying to describe. I could no longer be heard. And even if I could, I no longer had an audience. Even my mother would rather see the splendor than hear my description. I shut my mouth. There are times when to speak violates the moment, when silence represents the highest respect. The word for such times is reverence. The prayer for such time is hallowed be thy name. And the place for this prayer is the chapel. If there are walls, you don't notice them. If there is a pew, you don't need it. Your eyes will be fixed on God, and your knees will be on the floor. In the center of the room is a throne, and before the throne is a bench on which to kneel. Only you and God are here, and you can surmise who occupies the throne. Don't worry about having the right words. Worry about having the right heart. It's not eloquence he seeks, just honesty. This was a lesson that Job learned. If he had a fault, it was his tongue. He talked too much. Not that anyone could blame him. Calamity had pounced on the man like a lioness on a herd of gazelles. And by the time the rampage passed, there was hardly a wall standing or a loved one living. Enemies had slaughtered Job's cattle. The lightning had destroyed his sheep. Strong winds had left his partying kids buried in wreckage. And that was just the first day. Job hadn't even had time to call Allstate before he saw the leprosy on his hands and the boils on his skin. His wife, compassionate soul that she was, told him to curse God and die. His 4 friends came along with a bedside manner of drill sergeants, telling him that God is fair and pain is the result of evil, and sure as 2 + 2 = 4, Job must have some criminal record in his background to suffer as he did. Each had his own interpretation of God, and each spoke long and loud about who God is and why God did what he did. They weren't the only ones talking about God. When his accusers paused, Job gave his response. Back and forth they went. And the verbal ping pong continues for 23 chapters. Finally, Job has enough of this answering. No more discussion group chit chat. It's time for the keynote address. He grips the microphone with one hand and the pulpit with the other and launches forth. For 6 chapters, Job gives his opinions on God. This time, the chapter's headings read, and Job continued, and Job continued, and Job continued. He defines God, explains God, and reviews God. One gets the impression that Job knows more about God than God does himself. We are 37 chapters into the book before God clears his throat to speak. Chapter 38 begins with these words. Then the Lord answered Job. If your Bible is like mine, there's a mistake in this verse. Oh, the words are fine, but the printer uses the wrong size type. The word should look like this. And then the Lord answered Job. God speaks. Faces turn toward the sky. Winds bend the trees. Neighbors plunge into storm shelters. Cats scurry up trees and dogs duck in the bushes. Something's a-blowing in, honey. Best get them sheets in off the line. God has no more than opened his mouth before Job knows he should have kept his sore one shut. In chapter 38, verses 3 through 6, this is God speaking. I will ask you questions, and you must answer me. Where were you when I made the earth's foundation? Tell me if you understand. Who marked off how big it should be? Surely you know. Who stretched a ruler across it? What were the earth's foundations set on? Or who put its cornerstone in place when the morning stars sang together and all the angels shouted for joy? God floods the sky with queries, and Job cannot help but get the point. Only God defines God. You've got to know the alphabet before you can read. And God tells Job, you don't even know the ABCs of heaven, much less the vocabulary. For the first time, Job, the Father's implication is clear. I don't know. I had a momentary glitch there, so hopefully it is still continued. The Father's implication is clear. As soon as you are able to handle these simple matters of storing stars and stretching the neck of the ostrich, then we'll have a talk about pain and suffering. But until then, we can do without your commentary. Does Job get the message? I think he does. Listen to his response in chapter 40, verse 4. I am not worthy. I cannot answer you anything. I will put my hand over my mouth. Notice the change. Before he heard God, Job couldn't speak enough. After he heard God, he couldn't speak at all. Silence was the only proper response. The word for such moments is reverence. The room for such moments is the chapel. The phrase for the chapel is, hallowed be thy name. This phrase is a petition, not a proclamation, a request, not an announcement. Hallowed be your name. We enter the chapel and beseech, be hallowed, Lord. Do whatever it takes to be holy in my life. Take your rightful place on the throne. Exalt yourself, magnify yourself, glorify yourself. You be Lord, and I'll be quiet. The word hallowed or hallowed comes from the word holy, and the word holy means to separate. The ancestry of the term can be traced back to an ancient word which means to cut. To be holy, then, is to be a cut above the norm, superior, extraordinary. Remember what we learned in the observatory? The Holy One dwells on a different level than the rest of us. What frightens us does not frighten him. What troubles us does not trouble him. I'm more a landlubber than a sailor, but I've puttered around in a bass boat enough to know that the secret for finding land in a storm is not aiming your boat at another boat. It's not staring at the waves. You set your sights on an object unaffected by the wind, a light on the shore, and go straight toward it. The light is unaffected by the storm. By seeking God in the chapel, you do the same. When you set your sights on God, you focus on one a cut above any storm life may bring. Like Job, you find peace in the pain. Like Job, you cover your mouth and sit still. Psalm 46:10 says, "Be still and know that I am God." This verse contains a command with a promise. The command, be still, cover your mouth, bend your knees. The promise, you will know that I am God. The vessel of faith journeys on soft waters. Belief rides on the wings of waiting. Linger in the chapel. Linger often in the chapel. In the midst of your daily storms, make it a point to be still and set your sights on Him. Let God be God. Let Him bathe you in His glory so that both your breath and your troubles are sucked from your soul. Be still. Be quiet. Be open and willing. Then you will know that God is God, and you can't help but confess, hallowed be your name. I love that. Entering into the chapel, sitting at the foot of the throne with God Himself there to commune with you, listening to you, but we need to sometimes just be quiet and listen. And that's my prayer for you, is spend time in the chapel. Spend time quietly listening to God and what He has to say to you. He'll bless you every time. Thank you for joining me. I hope to see you next week, and we will continue in this wonderful book by Max Lucado. Until then, my prayers are with you. May God richly bless you and lead you according to His will for your life.